Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural Experiential Philanthropy series. This is a program that is going to bring stories of generous and influential thought leaders to our Northeastern community. Now, as Senior Vice President for Advancement at Northeastern, I have the privilege and the pleasure of working with some of the most altruistic, most thoughtful, and most innovative people in the world. People who really understand the multiplier effect that comes when you invest in people. I would say people exactly like you. This is an audience we have with us today of intergenerational leaders. We have student ambassadors, members of our Young Alumni Board, representatives from our Parents Leadership Council, the Frank Palmer Spear Society, trustees emeriti. You represent the best of Northeastern and a network of individuals who share a passion for the university, a passion for young people, and a passion for creating a better world. So today, as we hear from world-renowned author and activist, Ambassador Swanee Hunt, I invite you to contribute your ideas and questions to the chat feature. So our own Alva Gardner, one of our young global leaders and a Women Who Empower ambassador, can include your comments and questions in a moderated discussion, which will follow Ambassador Hunt's talk in just a few minutes. Now, I have to say, I have been dying to get Swanee Hunt to speak to the Northeastern community for a couple of years now. When I first heard her speak at a dinner in Boston, I left the event just completely moved, inspired beyond words, really inspired to tears. She is a person who acts with both passion, but also a remarkable degree of compassion. Her achievements are really too numerous to recite here in this moment. But I think that achievements are really best measured by action, not by accolades. And certainly, Swanee's actions have been the testament to her wide-ranging impact. So before we move to her talk, I'd like to share with you just one example of an extraordinary action that she's taken to move millions. We'll please have the video for just a few minutes.
So I'm working on my will, which I do every year. And my investments had done better than Helen's because she was in real estate and I was in the market. That's before the crash, of course. And so I said, okay, if I die right now, I'm going to leave $5 million to Helen for her to put into her work with women's foundations all over the country. Because she's in the National Women's Hall of Fame. You know, I mean, she's like spectacular at this. I said, the only requirement, Helen, in my will is that you have to be the head of this. And then I thought, oh no, what if I don't die? Like, then she won't get the 5 million. Like, what if she dies at some point before I do? I need to do it now. If I'm going to do it, if I would do it when I would die this year, why wouldn't I do it while I'm alive this year? Like, what is, like, yeah, duh. So I had to tell her then. I wanted to give her this 5 million. So we had a hard time getting together. We were in a hotel together, 11 o'clock at night. We were there for some company meetings. I call her, I say, Helen, I got to talk to you. And she thinks my marriage is falling apart. So we get together. I say, hey, Helen, listen, I tell her the story about the will. And I say, but, you know, I want to do it now. I'm such a believer in you. So tell me, you know, I want to just transfer this money from me into some kind of charitable vehicle. It could be your foundation, whatever. She starts crying. She said, oh, the impact that this is going to have. Maybe we could get it, maybe we could devote it to women and girls and, you know, and maybe we could get somebody to match it. I said, yeah, well, however. And she said, you know, $5 million, I mean, it really has a ring, but 10 million has more of a ring. Could you do 10 million? And I said, Helen, you know, and so then we start this like back and forth. And I said, well, do you want to do some? She said, okay. I said, well, what if I do 8 and you do 2? People think that philanthropy has to be so, like you just have to have it all lined up and perfect before you act. That's not how it works. You know, people who are philanthropic, they can just decide and they can just give and be bold. So we put together this 10 million. And then Helen said, okay, I'm going to take this. We're going to make this into 150 million. What? And she said, women have got to raise the bar. We've been nickel and diming our philanthropy for too long. we're going to have we're going to make this a real movement. We're going to call it Women Moving Millions. I'm going to collect women who will do at least $1 million, and we're going to tally how much they're willing to do for women and girls, and we're going to put together 150 million. Wow. And she's like this great thinker. She really is a great thinker. And so then the market crashes right in the middle of it. She says, yeah, we're going to do it over like a 2-year period. And instead of 150, she puts together 176 million. I mean, that's when you have a great idea and Helen Hunt. I mean, look out, fasten your seatbelt. And she did it with the idea of we're a group. Women love groups. We're a group. Join our group, be part of us. And women get really like nervous about being the lead gift, about being the biggest gift. But so if they're part of a group, and she understood that psychology. She's great. Barron's, which has this list of like the 25 most effective philanthropists, they put Helen and me in there, but it was just because of this idea. And now she's just building it and building it and building it. It's going on and on. It's fabulous. Women from different continents. It's great.
So there was an article I had the opportunity to read that accompanied the video that you just saw. And in that article, Swanee said, if my goal is bold enough and my vision is far reaching enough, I will never see the success. I have to say I disagree. Yes, Swanee, your goals are incredibly bold. Yes, your vision is incredibly far reaching. But I believe that the success you have had can already be seen in the so many lives that you've touched, the people whose conditions you've improved, and those that you've encouraged to use the power of philanthropy to make a more empowered world. So it is an incredible honor to share this program with all of the people in our Northeastern audience today. And without further ado, I'd like to give you Swanee Hunt.
It's very, very good to see you. Thank you very much. I loved watching. I loved watching me talk about Helen. I mean, I can't wait to tell her about this. I'll call her right after this. Doesn't she sound great? And she but then I got embarrassed watching it, and I was thinking, here we're just throwing around the word million and million this and million that. And philanthropy isn't about actually money. Philanthropy is the love of people. And some people express that love like my mother did, who would go to hospitals, and she would say, because she didn't have money to give. And so she would go to a hospital and she would go up to a certain floor, and she would say to the nurse who hasn't had a visitor, and she would spend 2 hours with someone she'd never met before, just sitting there and hearing about their lives, talking about whatever, whatever the sermon was at church or whatever. She did this over and over. In fact, anytime we were all sitting at the dinner table and she wasn't there and we were waiting, we knew it was because she was at hospital and, she wouldn't leave to come home. Boy, you learn from that. My parents were both born poor, like really poor, like couldn't afford college kind of poor, and or finish high school in the case of my father. They were raised on farms, but then my father, it's a long story, but he became this extraordinarily lucky guy who was real smart, but there are a lot of real smart people out there. He was just lucky, and he drilled an oil well. He wasn't an oil man, right? He drilled an oil well because it was this sort of Wild West period of time. He was born in 89, by the way, 1889. My grandfather fought in the Civil War. So he drilled this oil well, and bingo, he became the richest man in the world, because it was the largest oil field in the world, and it was before the Middle East discoveries. So that's why when Helen and I are talking about, well, what if we do $1 million here or $1 million there, it sounds so ridiculous. unless you know that my parents couldn't afford to go to college. Then you can think, huh, there are pieces to this story that actually are so unpredictable. And I think that's what I would say to you on this call. There are pieces to your story, and you have no idea how they're going to come out. My mother had no idea when she was raised on her farm, very, very devout, that when she was 24, and she had taught herself to type, and so she was working as a typist in a legal law firm, and a man 30 years older than she was walked down the hall and seduced her. She became pregnant. She ended up in New York City, knowing no one, meaning no one, put up in an apartment. It was time to get, she didn't know how the baby was even born. She gets herself to a hospital, etc. And and she was his mistress for um, 14 years. And that was a time when people didn't have mistresses. It wasn't. I mean, it's not like, oh, we're going to live together before we get married. We're talking about in the 40s. So I think that watching what she lived through with our father, who was really, really tyrannical when we finally moved into his home, and just seeing how he had such control over her. And that, I think it's not a surprise that all three of us daughters, Helen and then another sister, June, that we all turned out working in one way or another very much on women's empowerment. And I didn't even think about that until I was probably 15 years ago, and we'd been doing it for 30 years at that point. It didn't dawn on me that that was a key. Sometimes you don't even understand why you're doing the kinds of things you're doing until you look back. But it does make a point that your experiences in your life, that's what's going to, more than anything else, it's going to govern how you end up as a philanthropist. And again, as a philanthropist, I'm talking about how you give your time, how you give your attention, how you give your care. And if you're giving money, great. But you also know, I hope, that the highest percentage of giving, let me say it differently, that the lower your income, the higher your percentage of giving. In other words, people who are living on food stamps give more than the wealthiest of the wealthy in terms of percentage. And they make choices about whether or not their kid who's starting school is going to have 2 pair or 1 pair of shoes. But they still will give. Let's say it's at their church, and they're still giving there, and they know that that's they do that at a cost, not just to themselves, but to their kids, to everybody else. I mean, they make much, much, much bigger sacrifices than what you heard on that video. And it's really, really important to remember that. And philanthropy is not for the rich. Philanthropy is for us all. Another reason, when you look at my bio in terms of the things that you'll see there, like what is the deal about mental health and starting a halfway house and leading a mental health reform? My father's oldest son, who was actually my mother's age because of that age differential, because he picked up my mother when he was 30 years older. His oldest son was paranoid schizophrenic, very, very, very sick, lobotomized. Lobotomy, it was a reasonable treatment at the time in the 40s and 50s for people who were so violent that they were being kept in shackles. And that was because we didn't have any of the psychotropic drugs that we have now to deal with the hallucinations and the terrible, terrible fears. I mean, Hassie always thought we were trying to kill him, and he would, he wouldn't step on the carpets because they were wired underneath, et cetera, which they weren't. But he had had so many series of shock treatments, and by that I mean hundreds of series. And so Mom went up, took us kids. I was probably 8 years old, 7. Took us up to where he was hospitalized. We were living in Dallas. Went to the hospital, mental hospital, up in New York, upstate New York, and we went, and I didn't know what to expect, but out came this man who I probably curtsied. We were taught to curtsy. I'm sure I didn't put my hand out to shake his hand, but I couldn't have anyway. I mean, he was standing there like this, and he was saying, "Vicious killer, vicious killer, vicious killer. Eyes can kill, eyes can kill, eyes can kill." And Mom said to Dad, "Oh, let's bring him home. He shouldn't be here. Let's bring him home." And that's what I mean by philanthropy. That's the person who would go to the hospitals and, dinner be damned, right? That's where I learned philanthropy, was from Mother. So anyway, Hassie came home, and then for the next 10 years, I lived with my brother, who was paranoid schizophrenic, and we were together, every night at dinner and after dinner. And the two things came out of that. Was just this sense of, no, he isn't a paranoid schizophrenic. I know I said that at the beginning, but he had a condition called schizophrenia. And his version of that condition was to be extremely, extremely fearful and believe that people were out to get him. That's a much better way to say it. So I came to have an understanding of that quite a bit, and a huge empathy for that. And I wasn't afraid of it. And so when I was 23, I became a chaplain in a mental hospital. I was in seminary. I was in seminary. I spent 8 years in seminary. Good Lord, deliver us. In theological seminaries. I was raised Southern Baptist, very conservative. Well, Southern Baptist. And I consider myself still a woman of faith. I'm not Southern Baptist, but my faith, very, very important to me. So that's how I ended up being a chaplain in the mental hospital. And my first husband and I started this halfway house for people who were on their way to a mental hospital unless we could help support them ahead, or they were coming out of a mental hospital. And if we could be there to help them stabilize. Out of that, one thing leads to another. I'm old, I'm 70. So it's like I have all these strata in my life. So after the time with Hassie at home and working as a chaplain in the mental hospital, starting the halfway house, and then creating a whole mental health reform for the city. And that's what your lives look like, or will look like. It's you have your individual experience, and then you bring it into some kind of work setting, and possibly you're going to say from that experience, you know what, I can't say fucked up on this call, can I? And we have a fucked up society here on this particular issue. I can say that because I told you I went to seminary for 8 years. So anyway, you then start thinking systemically, like, what's wrong in the way we're structured, which takes me, I think, to the last, and that is, I grew up in the 60s, and I used to tell my kids, I have 3 kids, I wish you had been there. I wish you had been there in the 60s. It was so hard, and it was so wonderful to be in the streets. There were 3 movements happening at the same time. There was the civil rights movement, there was the anti-war movement, and there was _ the women's movement. Women were making 49 cents on a man's dollar for the same work. 49 cents to a dollar. Everything that, I mean, we had so many barriers. I mean, I had a choice, a career choice between being a secretary and being a nurse. Oh, or a school teacher. I had three choices. Now, that was it. That's all we knew. And so what, I mean, think about it today. I can't believe what you have. You have the same thing. You have this nexus of movements and people are in the streets. And I'm so glad that you all and oh, thank you. I look younger than 70, by the way. Someone just said that on the chat, but I have to tell you, you need to feel okay about looking 70 too. So anyway, so there was this excitement. Look, we were horrified. We were angry. We were so angry at why we were in the streets. We were looking at body bags coming back from Vietnam in a war that just, went and had made no sense. And we were bombing the hell out of all of these villages. I mean, we're not the ones who suffered during Vietnam. The Vietnamese and Cambodians, they were losing millions of people because of our bombs. And then women were, the abuse, you could be beat up. This is all before domestic violence had a name even. And women in my mother's situation were being just strangled literally and in other ways. And so civil rights, I mean, how do you even describe it? This was 1963, 1965. I didn't know one African American except for the maids. Have you all seen the movie The Help? I see The Help. That's where I grew up. They were called The Help. And the men who worked in the yard, who were like 50 years old, 60 years old, they were called the yard boys. Just to start you off, right? And there's something compelling about having been in the streets in terms of passion. And I'll tell you just two quick moments, little vignettes. One is I'm now 29, and I say to people at the family company, which is oil and gas, I say, well, look, how come there are no women who are members of the Petroleum Club? The Petroleum Club, that's very important. A club is where the guys get together and they make deals. It's like on a golf course, right? And that's where the deals are made. Then you go into the office and you work out the details. But it's over the lunches and all that where you build the trust and make the deal. So that it's important that there could be no women. So I made a reservation, invited the vice president of the company to join me. And he said, well, sure, I'll join you for lunch. I said, great. And he said, why don't we go such and such place? I said, no, let's go to the Petroleum Club. He said, okay. So we go and get off the elevator, and there's this tall African-American man, and this is going to tie back. You're going to see how it ties together. He's standing there. Elevator door opens. We walk out. He's wearing a red jacket, and he says, welcome. I have a beautiful table over here in the ladies' dining room. Ladies' dining room is very small, and that's where either ladies, maybe they're the wives, whoever, of the executives of the companies, or if it's a lady and a man, then you have to go to the ladies' dining room. So you can have men in the ladies' dining room, but you couldn't have a woman sullying the men's dining room. Okay, so I say, well, no, actually, we're going to have our lunch in the main dining room. And Tom from the company kind of looks at me and said, all right. And I said, no, Tom, it's okay. And the maitre d' says, well, there's a beautiful table over here right by the window. And I said, no, actually, I can see there's my name on that table over there. Now you see, there's a great advantage to having a name like Swanee, because no one knows who you are, whether you're male or female. All they know is you sound Southern. So that's, it went back and forth, back and forth. Um, won't you please sit over here? I said, no, I'd rather sit over at this table. Because that's what we were taught in these consciousness raising groups. Again, it's before your time, but we would just practice and practice. Just say the same thing, smile, say the same thing, smile. Just don't give in, just keep it going. And finally, the tall black man in the red jacket looked at me and he said, Miss, I can take you to that table and it will cost me my job. And that's when I realized that he and I had much more in common than I had with anyone else in that scene, in that moment. So that's what life was like. And I knew there was nothing to do except say, Tom, why don't we go have lunch someplace else? That's fine. So it's like I lost that one. But at some point, I had to take my anger and turn it into action. So if I were to put out some basic principles, that would be one of them. To think in terms of groups, to think in terms of philanthropy is it's whatever you give out of your generosity. To think about your own personal experiences and to take anger and turn it into action. And the last moment I'll give you is when I'm in seminary and I'm doing too many degrees, and like one in ethics and in pastoral care. So the pastoral care means I'm, going to hospitals like mom and sitting by people's beds and working in mental hospitals, etc. And then the ethics part is like, what's right or wrong with this world? So I met with my ethics professor and I said, look, this change is happening at the company. There's going to be all kinds of money. And I don't know what to do. And he said, what do you mean? And I think I was crying at the time. And I was talking about my love of the story of St. Francis of Assisi. Now, for those of you who don't remember it, St. Francis was the son of a merchant who made fabric. And when he went down to market carrying the very fine fabrics of his father, he passed by a chapel that was all falling apart. The rocks were crumbling, etc. He sold the fabrics, and he was coming back, and he gave all of the money, meaning 100% of the money, to the little chapel so they could rebuild it. He got home. His father was apoplectic and locked him up in a tower until the traveling priest came by to be, probably a bishop, to adjudicate the situation. And you'll find images of this in the paintings of, there's the bishop, and then there's the father, and then there's Francis, and Francis is standing there, actually naked as a jaybird, because he took off all of his clothes and put them, threw them down at his father's feet and said, I used to say you're my father. Now I say my father in heaven. And you can have the cloth back. You can have the fabrics back. At which point the bishop takes his long robe and kind of drapes it around, Francis, etc. It's quite a beautiful story, actually, and that was the Franciscan order in the beginning of it, vows of poverty. There's something wonderful about that story. It was so pure. I loved it. And I said to my professor, that's where I want to be, but I have all this money, and should I be doing something very intentional with it, or should I like to try to gain more power? But I was studying the work of a theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, who said power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was coming out of the Hitler time. And I said, so power is going to corrupt. And yet if I give it away, then I don't have anything to try to make something new. And who I am, I tend to be entrepreneurial. And so back and forth and back and forth. And I said, okay, I'm making a choice. I'm going to choose to accumulate as much power as I can. And I'm going to do it unashamedly, knowing also that in the process I will be corrupted. And speaking of groups, that's really when you need to have groups around you to say, you know, what you're doing, it's self-serving, it's you're being megalomaniacal. You think that you're some, you know, great shakes. It's being unkind. You're throwing your power around or whatever. You've got to have people around you. And that's not about how many $1 million you have. That's about if you're the president of an organization. You know, that's about any kind of serving of others that you're doing. If you decide you're going to make it as big as you possibly can, you've got to balance that with having people around you who will tell you, you know, you've become big-headed. Gee, what an awful note to end on. So let you all save me. Someone ask a question.
Thank you so much, Swanee or Ambassador Hunt. We really appreciated your viewpoints. I mean, you've had an amazing journey, and I for one really appreciated hearing how your history shaped your philanthropic journey. That's what we need today. Um, for the audience, if you have any questions, please be sure to put them in the chat so that I can ask them to Ambassador Hunt. And we have about 15 minutes for questions, and then I'm going to pass on to Diane to ask the final questions and close out the evening. So, or I'm in the UK, so that's why I say evening, Swanee, just in case you were wondering. So I guess for our first question, I kind of want to go back to that point where you talk about the nexus of the movement of the 60s, you know, civil rights, women's rights, and the anti-war movement. From what I can see from my research and your remarks tonight, with your family foundation, Hunt Alternatives, you've been able to take that experience and fund over 400 community-based organizations addressing issues like violence prevention, education, and leadership development in urban communities. So bringing it back to the nexus discussion, you mentioned that today we find ourselves in a kind of nexus again. We have, again, a kind of civil rights movement through Black Lives Matters.
Mm-hmm.
We are back to talking about women's rights because, yes, there's been a lot of change, but there's still a long way to go before women are considered to have an equal seat at the table. And then we find ourselves with a number of wars. We have the physical wars, and then we have the war against pollution, the war to save our world. And then we have now this war of COVID. So my question to you is, how might we, as the next generation of leaders, make smart investments in our community, considering that we are back at this nexus where things are boiling over?
Right, right. And I want to make sure that we're not thinking that we haven't been living with these problems, by the way. That's something we've got to come to terms with. That we live with the injustices and the injustices and the injustice literally for decades before we start talking as a society about police brutality or about Black Lives Matter, you know, in general. And how is it possible that we become so accustomed to it? In a way, we collude. Those of us who are aware that it's going on, whatever the injustice is. We're aware of it, but I really, really wanted to try this recipe, and I know it's going to take longer to fix than I have, but I've been wanting to figure out how to make paella. I got to go to you just get into, got to go to Whole Foods, got to, and we don't focus in, we don't dig in and lean in to saying this is happening and it is intolerable. And too often the question becomes, well, is it possible for me to do anything about it? That is irrelevant. If I could urge, if you heard me say one thing, that this whole construct of what's possible, throw it out. Throw it out. That's not how change happens. Nelson Mandela said it's impossible till someone does it. And that has been true, I think, forever. So throw that idea out of your life. All it is a construct. And just, I think the question is, what needs to be done? What's the goal? And then you take it from there. Now, are you going to be strategic? Absolutely. How are you going to be strategic? There's a key to that. And that is the saying I learned from my friends in Africa: nothing about us without us. The experts are not sitting around the table meeting with their investment managers. The experts aren't giving speeches like I'm giving. The experts are living the reality. They have to be major voices at the table. I don't mean you add one or two people who are poor if you're talking about poverty. I mean, they have to be the people who are guiding this. And if we don't do that, we are so likely to lose our way. I teach this at Harvard. I've been teaching there for 20 years. And I was teaching about peace negotiations and why you have to include the people from all different sides of a conflict if you're going to have a peace agreement that lasts. I'm talking about during a war. And there was a guy who was very smart and from Sri Lanka, and he said, Ambassador Hunt, I understand what you're saying, but I've been involved in peace negotiations, and if you bring in more people than the people who are causing the war, you're going to prolong it. It just gets messy. And I said, yeah, okay, it's messy and it gets prolonged. That's it. That's all you can say about it. It's messy and it gets prolonged, and you end up with a peace agreement that has a chance of lasting. And so you can't be dissuaded by people who want to let's just get it done. You've got to go through the steps of saying, what is really going on here? People, come teach me. Come teach me. Let me look at models of other people. Let me especially read about people's mistakes. You learn so much more about reading other people's mistakes, talking to them, and also you learn it when you tell your mistakes. Because as I tell my mistakes and tell my students my mistakes, I hear them. I hear them over and over, and I usually have some kind of insight about how I screwed up and why. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of the traumas that have happened to you. That's what's going to equip you to do the work you want to do. Don't be afraid of how screwed up your education was, or your family, or your whatever. Don't be afraid if you went to prison. Don't be afraid of any of that. All of that is who you are. All of it is who you are. And it's you that you're bringing into your philanthropy.
Oh, thank you so much for that feedback, Ambassador Hunt. And I think one thing that you said really struck a chord with me, and I think it leads us to one of the next questions from the audience. And it's about bringing people to the table. So from the audience, we have Daisy Kendrick, who said that you speak about being entrepreneurial within philanthropy. And she was just wondering if you could give more examples of areas or projects you personally were involved in that didn't just give money to a cause, didn't just, give, like you said, the people at the tables advice or
Right,
thoughts, but
right,
really empowered people.
right. Daisy, put your hand up. I'm gonna scroll across 6 screens. So keep waving your hand so I can find you. Or can I see you? Or are you on just by voice? I don't see anyone waving. Okay, I'm gonna pretend like I can see you. All right. Yeah, it's those. we all have these watershed moments, right? And you don't know it when it's happening usually. You know it when you look back and you say, yeah, when I think about that class I took, that professor, or when I think about that argument I had with my husband or my wife or whatever, and that was the moment where I learned blah blah blah. At the time, I was just so mad. I should speak for myself. So I'm in Vienna. I'm an ambassador, and that's the most powerful place to be when there's a genocide happening next door. Because I'm the U.S. ambassador, it's so dangerous that we didn't even have a functioning embassy in the country of Bosnia. Bosnia was part of Yugoslavia, big country breaking apart after the implosion of communism. And there was this genocide, and said that kind of casually, didn't I? This genocide. And 4 million people and 150,000 Muslims slaughtered. And so that was my whole passion, was trying to do something to stop that, and failed. That's one of my failure stories. And did my voice matter? I wasn't, at a policy level, I wasn't able to stop it. At a human level, I could be there. And I was asked to go and spend time with the women to figure out if they could be helpful in any way. And when I was told afterwards, well, gee, we wish the women had organized. And I could say, well, there were 40 women's organizations. They were all multicultural, multi-ethnic. They were doing everything they could to stop the war. And there was a union of women's organizations. What do you mean you wish they had organized? People who weren't organized was the State Department, the US government. We didn't have any way to connect to them. So this massacre happens, 8,000 unarmed boys and men are killed, tens of thousands of women raped. So that's where I started leaning in, and at least so that they would not be forgotten, feel forgotten. I mean, you have to give people hope. And what I have not done is humanitarian work, a huge respecter of it, but that's not where I've put my focus. So what I'm going to tell you is the moment I was doing humanitarian, and it's the moment that I realized that there was something that had to be done that was more entrepreneurial. And that is, so I put together this event in Bosnia, and it's going to be from the survivors, the women who survived this particular attack, and all of their husbands, brothers, sons, etc., were killed. And so I said, let's all gather together. And the story is too long, but so they were all together, and the American military had to give us protection because Queen Noor was going to fly in from Jordan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we had to have protection. Now, the Serbs had committed the atrocities, 90% of them. Serbs, right? And I'm not doing collective guilt about Serbia. I'm just saying that was the case. And then the victims were the Muslims. And so you had Christians slaughtering Muslims, which is pretty interesting. And so I say the military, we got to have protection. They said, well, only if you're being even-handed. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I mean, if you're going to have, mothers of the Muslims who were killed, then you've got to have the mothers of the Serb soldiers. And I said, General, that's not how this works. And he said, sorry, unless it's even handed, we can't do that. So I said, okay. And I go to talk to one of the women. And I say, look, here's the situation. I tell exactly what I just said to you. That we have to have, can we invite the mothers of the Serb soldiers who committed the genocides, who slaughtered their sons, essentially. And they remember that this is 1 year. Everything is fresh. 1 year is like 1 hour after an atrocity like this. And this woman looks at me. One of the women stands there and she starts to faint. She has to be hospitalized. Another woman, she looked at me, and I was thinking, everything I know about mental health, everything says that that was an awful thing to do. You do not say something like that to a traumatized person right in the middle of reliving the trauma. And she looked at me and she said, Ambassador Hunt, we're all mothers. That was the moment. That was the moment for me where I said, I mean, I have goosebumps all over, and that was 25 years ago. There was there was a power in that idea. And out of that came an initiative which has led to the elevation of women to get them to the negotiating tables. Because what we know, and we have the stats on this now, what we know is that if you have women actually at the high level negotiating tables, you will prevent a war, you will stop a war much, much more likely. In fact, normally a peace agreement lasts 5 years. And in fact, the biggest predictor of a war is that you've already been to war, right? The country's already been at war. If you are trying to get to 20 years, which means really it holds, right? If you have women as signatories to that peace agreement who are really involved in it, you have 75% chance for that agreement to get to 20 years. And if it's all men, you have a 25% chance. Now, it's taken a lot of years to have enough of the experiences to where you could even measure it. But I have devoted myself to that for the last many years. That's how most people know me. They don't know of the 400 organizations back in Denver. They really know of me more as an internationalist doing that work. But it was because of that jerk of a general, right? Who said, no, we have to have the Serb mothers. And then the woman, the generosity of her spirit, when she said, of course we'll have them, we're all sharing the same pain, of course. And then the money I had, it comes together, right? The money I had to then create a whole initiative the money gave staying power to the idea. That's what the money does. It lets you hire up great staff and keep it going and keep it going and keep it going. You raise money, et cetera, et cetera. But if you have your own wealth, obviously, you can keep it going more easily. So that was one of those moments. I would love to know, if not today, then other times. I hope you'll write to me and tell me about moments that you think have been critical. Just a conversation with someone, someplace I don't know, just some way, you screwed up and you were embarrassed about such and such, but when you look back and you say, wait, that made a difference in my life. I don't mean it made me stronger because I survived. I mean, that just something clicked when that happened.
Wow, that is an absolutely, I hope the audience agrees with me. It's an absolutely powerful story that you've shared. And I think one thing I've really gathered from your discussion is the influence of our history on our ability to be philanthropists.
Mhm.
And I think that's something a lot of people miss out on because they do focus on the money or they become self-serving. And I think that this is another great lead-in to a question from the audience. And this comes from Robin Knight. And I please excuse me if I said your name incorrectly. But she is an alumni of Northeastern, and she's my fellow Coloradan, and she is part of the Denver City Council.
Oh, really?
And yes, and
Hi,
she,
Robin, I can
for,
see you.
there she is.
Mhm.
And Robin, I hope I said your name correctly. Um, but I really I loved that she mentioned that she can still see your legacy in Colorado, and that's even me, Pikes Peak Center, I think
Oh, yeah.
there's yeah, I'm from Colorado Springs, so your legacy lives. And she had a question on your perspective on the dissonance between charitable giving and other types of giving. And specifically, she wanted to have your perspective on bridging from the individual giving sympathy um, to that individual engaging givers in more difficult work within systematic change.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, One of the things, Robin, Sam Gary is a name that you know. Sam died recently, and Sam was a great philanthropist. And he and his he and Nancy started something called the Charter Fund, and it was for young people. It basically the sons and daughters of wealthy people in Denver, for them to get together like once a month, and they didn't talk about giving money. They went to a homeless shelter and they stayed there for X number of hours, or they went to maybe some kind of landfill, or they went to some big problem area that you could see, and they just walked around and took it in. They went to Fort Logan Mental Health Center, right, the hospital, and that was critical in terms of making that bridge, because those of you who aren't in the big wealth world, you probably are not aware the enormous transfer of wealth that happens, and it's going to be even bigger now given certain tax changes. Enormous transfer of wealth, and it's going to people who are not prepared for it. So you'll have someone who has $1 billion foundation or whatever, and then is dying and leaving it, or maybe when he dies he's going to leave it in a foundation or something like that, and or just give it outright to his kids. We have to be thinking ahead about that. We need to be gathering, I think, very intentionally gathering the younger members of families who have disposable income. There's an organization called Resource Generation. I think it was born in the People's Republic of Boulder. And anyway, it's really John Hickenlooper is the person who got me involved at the beginning. So, who's now the new senator. Making those ties between the political world and the faith world, and the education sphere, all of that, and the media. But really important is the peer group. And and again, in any of those situations, you have to bring in the experts. There was a time, Robin, that um, a bunch of us got together and we created X amount of money in a pool. So I'm going to say I'm going to say it was $100,000 or $200,000. We said we wanted to go to such and such part of town. It used to be 5 Points. I don't know where it now, but it was a really poor part of town. But we weren't going to decide how it was going to be given, and we asked the community to elect their own people to make the decisions. A lot of things happen when you do that. Number one, it could be someone who doesn't have a high school degree, but who has the respect of the rest of the community. But another, well, obviously you have the expertise, and also that person, those people making those decisions, they have the experience of what it's like to say no, and no, and no, and no, and no, and no, and yes, and then no, and no, and no. I mean, it really makes it real, this whole question of not just the values of the community, but just the importance of human interactions instead of just seeing dollars and cents. I hope that's helpful. Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, I can't wait to meet you. Do we know each other? Have we met? Okay. But Ava, I have to say this, y'all, because it leads to a point I want to make. So Ava, the Pikes Peak Center, do you know that my husband, Charles Ansbacher, is the one, he built the symphony, and then he's the one whose dream was the Pikes Peak Center. So he got, the whole bond issue and, got it built. And I was just thinking about him yesterday, because when I was thinking about what I've done with my life, I kid you not, because I've done a whole lot of things. I kid you not that 80% of the things I've done were his idea. So guys, I want you to know that I want you to hear how important you are. Charles was a terrible critic of mine. I mean, just awful. Every night at dinner, I did this wrong, I did that wrong. He was my biggest fan. And he would defend me, to the last minute. But he was brilliant. So women in the crowd, marry the right guy. That's the best advice I can give you.
That's excellent advice. And I would like to say personally that the Pikes Peak Center and the Children's Chorale in Colorado Springs actually made me the person that I am today. Without it, I wouldn't be the same. So I want to thank you on a personal note.
Sure.
And I want to thank the audience for their incredible questions. And now I'm going to pass on to Diane, because I believe that she has the last question, and she'll be giving some concluding remarks. But thank you so much, Ambassador Hunt, for your time and your amazing answers for our audience.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Alva. And thank you, Swanee, for spending this incredible hour with us. Our audience does reflect an intergenerational group of people, from current students all the way through to our emeriti trustees. And what connects us to wanting to be with you is, I think we're all individuals who personally feel compelled to try to have an impact, to try to be change makers, to try to make a difference. At the same time, we're in an educational institution, and we are, we have a real commitment and a responsibility to the next generations. So you've given some advice, I think, to our up and coming leaders about throwing out the notions of what's impossible. But what would you say to all of us about how we can best support that next generation? You've been so generous in sharing your stories. You've also been incredibly generous about soliciting stories. Is that how we move forward in supporting one another? Or what are your thoughts about that?
Well, when I think about, as a girl, I think about how important the church was for me in terms of a group, having a group to be part of. That was much more important than anything I was doing individually. I think about when I was in my 20s, late teens and 20s, how there were individuals in particular, like a guy friend, meaning boyfriend, that sort of was the first time I never voted for a Democrat. I didn't vote for him, but I voted for a Democrat who lost, of course. And I wouldn't have before. My mother actually didn't want us to get married when she found out that he had voted for McGovern. She meant it. Tried to stop the marriage. So those were individuals. I mean, groups, individuals. I mentioned about Charles. I mentioned also about Sam Gary, and in Denver, this very established oilman and philanthropist, and how he came over one day and he said, "Let's talk." I said, "Sure." And we sat on my front porch in rocking chairs. And I kept wondering what was the deal he wanted, etc. There wasn't one. He just said, just started, like to spend some time with you. I was just, and look, here I am, 45 years later, remembering that he could say to me, I'm watching you. I think you could do good things in the world. Didn't tell me what to do. Didn't tell me what the next step was. Had no advice. No advice. Just pointed to me and said, "I believe in you." That the advice is good. I'm not saying not, but just pointing to a person saying, "You're worth this time in my day."
Thank you so much. And I think to all of our group, you can see why Swanee just moves all of us so much. Swanee, thank you for believing in so many people. Thank you for believing in our future. Thank you for believing in the power of philanthropy, in all of the wonderful, diverse, and beautiful meanings that word has. And thank you for being with us today. We really look forward to hearing from you again, and your generous spirit will carry us through the rest of the day and these months ahead. Thank you.
Good to see you all.
Bye-bye.